Stormwater and Resilience Financing in Rhode Island, brought to you by the University of Rhode Island's MPA program. My name is Leah Soloway from the New England Environmental Finance Center, and I'll be assisting with logistics for today's program along with Tess Clark from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. In case you haven't heard of the SNEP network before, the SNEP network's mission is to empower communities to achieve healthy watersheds, sustainable financing, and long-term climate resilience through management of stormwater and restoration projects. We focus on building local capacity by providing no-cost trainings, webinars, and technical assistance to communities in the SNEP region. If you want to learn more, please visit snepnetwork.org for more information. Before we begin the webinar, there are a few logistics we'd like you to keep in mind. Everyone will be on mute to ensure audio quality. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We look forward to answering questions, so please type in your questions at any time. Additionally, you can request a certificate of attendance for joining this webinar. Information on how to do so will be available in our follow-up email after the webinar. We also have closed captions available for today's webinar. To view the closed captions, please click the link that I'll put in the chat in a minute. Also, over in the control panel under handouts, we will have the presentation available for you to download. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to our guest presenters, Aaron and Courtney.
Thank you, Leah. My name is Aaron Lay. I am the director of URI's Master of Public Administration program. And today I have with me Courtney Green, who is one of our graduate students of the MPA program. We're very proud of Courtney. She works for Thoreau Environmental, and she'll be graduating this spring from URI with her master's degree. And so congratulations, Courtney. So I'm going to take a moment to kind of explain to everybody some of the background of this project. The original project, we were approached a couple of years ago to develop an inventory of financing tools that were available to municipalities in Rhode Island, and we agreed to do that. But when we agreed to do that, we realized pretty quickly that there was a pretty extensive inventory of financing mechanisms that were already out there. And so we agreed to update the financing mechanisms that are available to municipalities and to folks at the state level. And so we'll be putting together a manual of that. But we also wanted to add some additional value to what was already out there. And so we regrouped, we spoke to the folks at the SNEP network, and we pitched the idea that it might be a better idea to have some extensive interviews with people that are part of the Stormwater, Climate Resilience, and Green Infrastructure Network to learn a little bit more about the challenges and benefits of financing in Rhode Island. And so that's essentially where we're at now. We're presenting the results of that research. We did 40 interviews, over 40 interviews with folks. And what we essentially are doing is we're analyzing, or we've asked questions about the costs and benefits of the various financing mechanisms, the costs and benefits of local decision-making in Rhode Island, as well as changes that can be made to the pre-existing system. And so we have some very in-depth interviews that we've done with people, and most of them are just from Rhode Island. Courtney, can you take it back to the previous slide for 1 second? I'll just go over some of our research questions. I kind of went over them already a little bit, but I'm going to go into a little bit more precise detail about what we were asking. What we really wanted to know from the research that we were doing was, what are the dominant mechanisms used to finance green infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, and resilience infrastructure in Rhode Island? So we really wanted to know, what do people know about? How are they doing this? The other question that we had are, how are the various mechanisms viewed by those occupying the green infrastructure, stormwater, and resilience network in the field? So we wanted to hear again about the costs and benefits of these approaches, and maybe who might some of the opponents be of some of these approaches, and who might be some of the supporters of some of these approaches. And then lastly, how do network participants view the costs and benefits of localism in Rhode Island? We're a home rule state in Rhode Island. A lot of power is at the local level. We wanted to learn a little bit more about what are some of the costs and benefits of that, and what might be the ideal structure for managing stormwater in Rhode Island. So as for our methodology, we conducted 1 hour long interviews with people at the local, state and federal level, from nonprofits, the public sector, and the private sector. And we all did that via a snowball sample. For those of you who don't know what a snowball sample is, we started with one person during our interview process, and then we asked that person for referrals for future interviews. So we asked, who else would be a good person to talk to? And that's how we ended up with 41 interviews. We started with one person, and that got us to about 40. We did 17 public sector interviews, 11 private sector interviews, and 10 nonprofit sector interviews. And I can say that one of those public sector interviews was a federal agency. We had 4 state employees that were part of those public sector interviews, and we had 12 municipal officials that were part of those public sector interviews. For the private sector, we interviewed 6 consultants and 5 landscape industry actors. And then for the nonprofit community, we interviewed 6 participants of environmental organizations, 1 member of a planning organization, and 3 participants of watershed associations. What we did after we collected all those interviews, 41 interviews, we had 38 interviews that we wanted to use for analysis. So we had 3 that didn't quite work out or didn't go the way that we wanted them to go. And so we transcribed those interviews. We made sure that we had all of our text data, and then we went and inductively coded all 38 of those interviews. So we started to code them so that we could identify different themes that were emerging from our interviews with everybody. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to talk about some of the dominant funding mechanisms. And before we go to the next slide, I just want to inform everybody that we will be talking about grants today. We'll be talking about bonding. We'll be talking about tax increment financing as some of the dominant funding mechanisms. We're going to talk about a couple of potential funding mechanisms that haven't been adopted yet. That would be the stormwater utility and a tax exemption approach. And then we'll also, and special tax assessments. So we'll be talking about special tax assessments as an approach. So one of the first questions we asked was, we wanted to know what were the most familiar financing instruments that people in Rhode Island actually knew about. So we began our interviews by asking participants an open-ended question about which financing instruments first come to mind. So we wanted to see what was going to roll off people's tongues. And one of the things that we found was that folks overwhelmingly described grants as being the financing instrument that they were most familiar with. And that's not really all that much of a surprise to us. In fact, I was expecting to see a lot of grants. I was expecting to see a lot of bonds. I was expecting to see maybe ARPA money or anything like that. But what surprised me a little bit more was when people were describing stormwater utilities as a financing instrument that they were most familiar with. And this was a financing instrument that hasn't yet been adopted. The other thing that was kind of a little bit of a surprise was seeing certain entities in there. So we see the type of influence that an organization like the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank has, because we had 6 people describe that as the most familiar financing instrument that was available to them. But I think we even undercounted Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank a little bit, because you'll notice that stormwater project accelerators were something that folks were describing in their responses to us in the revolving loan fund, which in a case could be made that those are part of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank program. So it could be up to 9 mentions for the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank program. RIDOT's in there, they're under the consent decree, they get credits for stormwater projects. So that's one of the reasons why folks were bringing that one up. Private sector folks talked a little bit about incentives. That's kind of how that broke down. And I believe the capital budget response was somebody from the city. They do a lot of financing through the city.
So the first mechanism that we're going to talk about is grants. Like Aaron has already said, 21 participants described grants as the dominant mechanism for funding infrastructure projects here in Rhode Island, making them the most popular funding mechanism among our sample. Grants are governmental funds made available to states, municipalities, and organizations to fund programs and infrastructure projects that are typically awarded on a competitive basis. Generally, they will include a match requirement from the receiving entity equal to some percentage of the award amount. However, this match can vary significantly from a 1-to-1 match all the way down to no match requirement at all. Some examples include the federal stormwater grants, such as the Clean Water Act, non-point source grant, also known as a 319 grant, the EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Fund, FEMA's Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, SNEP program grants, and the grant that was generating quite a bit of enthusiasm among our participants, the Municipal Resilience Program grant.
All right, thank you, Courtney. So one of the things that we did was we asked our participants, what are some of the challenges and benefits of a predominantly grant-funded approach? And one of the things that we learned from those responses, you'll see to the right, you'll see all of the responses that were inductively coded. And you'll see under the grant heading, it'll say benefit and challenge. So in the parentheses, 24 people described grants as having benefits, or there were 24 mentions of grants being benefits. And so you'll see to the right of that, you'll see a description of all those benefits that we've coded through our analysis of the interviews that we've done. And I've listed them in kind of order of intensity. So network and education, there were 6 folks that described that as the benefit. Having more capital on hand was another description of the benefit that folks described. Now, these are probably not foreign to us. A lot of these things are things that we already know about the challenges and benefits of grants. But I think that there's also, we'll find some surprises as we're going on through our presentation here. But essentially, having more capital was important for grantees and for municipalities. Networking and education opportunities, that was kind of a surprise to me to see that that was something that was being listed as a benefit. It wasn't that much of a surprise for me to see that the most frequently described challenges included capacity and some of the grant requirements. But what was a surprise to me was when I broke down the data, I realized that a lot of municipalities were not responding about having capacity issues. It was folks from nonprofit organizations that were describing municipalities as having capacity issues, and it was folks maybe from the private sector that were saying that. I didn't see a whole lot of municipalities responding with that approach. So again, that was a surprise. Next slide. Here's a good response, and I'll be sprinkling in some of these responses as we go on, and I'll read this particular response from a nonprofit participant who described some of the challenges of a predominantly grant-funded approach. This individual said, you know, everyone's excited about receiving a grant, and they're kind of talking about their experience too. But as you talk to any municipality, you can't apply for all these grants. And I can see with the infrastructure funding coming through, it's a lot of administration of the funding that takes a huge amount of capacity as well. So until we really have more staff at the local level whose responsibility it is to maintain stormwater, I think these efforts are laudable and we're doing the best with what we can, but it's not a comprehensive approach.
All right, so the next dominant mechanism is bonds, and nearly all of our participants had knowledge of bonding as a funding mechanism. So what bonds are is a fixed income security, meaning they accrue interest at a specific rate, maturing over an extended period of time. Once fully matured, bonds are cashed in for their face value. They may be sold by public or private entities to raise capital for specific purposes. For example, green bonds are a specific type of bond issued to raise funds specifically for climate-related projects. In Rhode Island, state bonds are usually voted on through statewide ballot referenda, while municipalities can choose to send a package of bonds to voters in a local referenda.
All right, so here again, you'll see the description of the benefits and the challenges of bonding on the right side. And if there's any that are interesting to any of you, maybe you can put them in the chat or something like that. We can save a little bit of time for the end where I might be able to elaborate a little bit more on what folks were saying about that. But essentially, just to kind of give you the overview, is participants describe the influx of funding as one of the key benefits of bonding, as well as the potential of using bond money as leverage for other sources. So, being able to use bonding to match with a grant or something like that was something that people really talked favorably about. The most discussed challenges included executing ballot campaigns. So a lot of people thought it was a heavy lift to actually be able to have these things at the local level. Some people talked about bonding from the state level perspective, like, hey, look, we have to package these ballot campaigns together, and we have to make sure that there's something that's going to get voter approval. Another thing that was talked about at the local level was servicing the debt on the bonds. There were some communities that were starting to hit some of their debt limits, and so they couldn't actually go out and do any bonding. And then the lack of sustainability was something that was also talked about. This is not a sustainable funding source, and so some folks had some, I wouldn't say negative, but they looked at that as kind of one of the downsides is bonding. One of the other things I'm just going to say quickly about bonding is, and it didn't show up with a lot of intensity, but it is something to keep in mind, is that some communities have lower bond ratings, which is going to make borrowing to be a little bit more expensive for them. The other thing about bonding, I think that's really interesting, is that bonding can still get done through a stormwater utility. It's something that can get done through tax increment financing, is essentially a bond. That's one thing that I learned through this whole entire process. And then obviously it's something that can happen through the towns as well, and it's a very popular way of doing things. So here's a quote. This is a great quote that describes some of the challenges of servicing debt. This comes from a nonprofit participant. This individual says, I think that the financing costs associated with the bonds is something that's like rarely ever discussed, it seems. And what is it, like 30% of the bonds cost is on financing, something like that? I mean, I think it's a pretty significant number, but I've always thought, like, why are we bonding when we could be doing a revenue stream?
So the final dominant funding mechanism we're going to talk about is tax increment financing districts, also known as TIF districts. And about half of our participants were familiar with TIF districts as a financing mechanism. What that is it typically requires municipalities to identify a particular area that is underdeveloped and where development would be essentially stagnant without the incentives provided through public investment. And once that district is formally established, contributions to the taxing authority within the district are frozen for an extended period of time, which is usually about 15 years. And future increases in property taxes are diverted from the general funds and earmarked to pay for capital improvement projects, developer incentives, and the service of debt incurred by the redevelopment authority. While these districts do require enabling legislation to be established, that legislation already exists under Rhode Island Title 45, Chapter 33.2, the Municipal Tax Increment Financing Act.
So I thought tax increment financing could pose some of the most exciting opportunities. We only had 50% of our respondents were actually familiar with it. So there's a lot of learning that has to happen with tax increment financing still. There's a couple of interesting projects that could potentially be in the works. The one that a lot of people talked about was the Warren's Market to Medicom project. That's a project that's kind of worth looking at as perhaps a model of something that might happen in the future. And I believe the city of East Providence recently came out with a proposal to do a TIF district in one of their areas that they wanted to see redeveloped. So there's a couple of potential opportunities out there. But the most frequently cited benefit of TIF financing was to be able to finance projects without raising taxes. And again, the idea of a TIF is you're not doing the TIF just for the stormwater upgrades. You're doing the TIF as part of a larger project. It's part of a larger package. So you might be trying to redevelop something, and as part of that package, you might be adding in some stormwater upgrades or something like that, or resilience upgrades or whatever. The biggest hurdle described by our participants was educating the public about TIF districts. And I think across all of these financing mechanisms, educating the public was something that really kind of came up pretty consistently. But again, TIF districts, a couple of interesting opportunities out there. They can be a little bit logistically difficult, but there are consultants out there that really know how those work as well. So, And I'll just, and you can keep the slide right there, Courtney, but one of the interesting things that some folks might not know here is that the bond rates for TIF districts tend to be a little bit higher. That wasn't something that was captured in terms of frequency when we were doing our interviews, but we had a couple of respondents that pointed that out, that you kind of have to be careful because the bond rates are a little bit higher. There's a little bit more risk associated with the TIF district. The other thing about the TIF district is that you don't have to go to voters to do any referendums or anything like that to do the bonding. Rather, that's usually approved by the town council. So some of the challenges and benefits, this was a challenge that was described by one of our private sector participants. This person said, you have a lot of people oftentimes who do not know what it is and hear tax as the first word, and they have a Pavlovian response against it to say, wait a minute, you're going to, so you need a great advocacy campaign to lead in about it, and you need a really good disciplined political body to say what the money is going to be used for. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about some potential opportunities. These are a couple of approaches that haven't really been adopted yet in Rhode Island, but there are projects that have a ton of potential.
So the first of those is stormwater utility fees. All but 2 of our participants were familiar with stormwater utility fees as a financing mechanism, with 11 participants indicating that they were most familiar with this approach. Stormwater utility fees are charges that are usually assessed to property owners based on that property's impact on the locality's stormwater system. And so your impact is determined based on the amount of impervious cover on your property. Property owners can receive credits for installing best management practices and green infrastructure on their property that reduces impervious surface, and the revenues generated from the utility fees can be used as a dedicated funding source to finance stormwater mitigation infrastructure that doesn't necessarily need to compete with other interests in the general fund. Stormwater utilities also require enabling legislation, which has been passed statewide under Rhode Island General Law, Title 45, Chapter 61, Stormwater Management Districts. However, despite this enabling legislation being in place and a number of towns in Rhode Island having already conducted feasibility studies, no stormwater utility fees and districts have actually been established.
All right, thanks, Courtney. And the overwhelming number of our participants, again, described stormwater utility fees as A, something that they knew, and then B, it was probably to them the most sustainable way of funding. So this would be perhaps some way of, if you have all these grants that are creating these best management practices or BMPs, now all of a sudden you have a revenue stream that you can use for maintenance and things like that. So participants described incentives also as one of the key reasons why a stormwater utility might be a good approach. And then equity. Nonprofits would pay their fair share as well, whereas nonprofits don't generally pay pay property taxes and things like that because of their special status. Under a stormwater utility fee, they would also be responsible for perhaps their amount of impervious cover or whatever. The key challenges that were described were the opposition to the fees and politics. So a lot of people talked about the rain tax. It was branded as a rain tax, and I'll have a really good quote about that a little bit later. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of one of the challenges was somebody who described efficacy as the challenge. And this came up 5 times in our interviews. And so there were some folks at the municipal level who weren't necessarily in support of stormwater utility fees because they felt that it might be a little bit difficult to demonstrate the efficacy of the stormwater utility approach. And what they meant was it was hard for them to describe to stakeholders how much water quality had actually been improved. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that will make it so a stormwater utility will never exist, but it's one of those challenges, I think, where if people want to see a stormwater utility in place, they're probably going to have to find maybe some research out there that's demonstrated the success of the water quality improvements and to have firm data to back that up. Again, here's a good quote that I selected from one of our private sector participants. This individual said, "You've got to overcome the political hurdles," which is enormous because, you know, it's slandered with the rain tax, right? And makes it automatically sound ridiculous. But it's very easy to brand it that way, you know, and people want to hear it branded that way. And it's like, oh, this is so stupid. Like, why this rain tax? Like, I can't believe they're taxing us on the rain.
Next, we're going to talk about public-private partnerships, or P3s, and 26 participants in our study had knowledge of P3s as a funding mechanism, though there was a pretty broad definition of what actually counted as a public-private partnership. So to be clear, the EPA defines a public-private partnership as a performance-based contract between the public sector at any level of government and the private sector, usually a consortium of private companies working together to arrange financing, delivery, and typically long-term operations and maintenance of public infrastructure. So the key departure here from typical procurement processes is that P3s allow firms to become responsible for all aspects of a project, including the financing, implementation, and maintenance. This divergence from typical procurement processes shifts the risk away from public sector and onto the private sector.
So again, a lot of people knew about these, but there's a lot of people that had varying definitions of what a public-private partnership might be. So some folks have really broad definitions of what it meant, and some folks have very specific definitions of what it meant. But for those people that, you know, could give some sort of example or who felt like they wanted to elaborate about public-private partnerships, they did describe the mutual benefit between the public sector and the private sector as one of the benefits. And I think that that's something that a lot of us already know about. But as Courtney already alluded to as well, shifting risk is something that came up quite a bit. So shifting some of the risk to the private sector versus having that at the public sector. One of the key challenges that was described by some of our participants was lack of enforcement at the state level. And so some people felt that if there was a little bit more enforcement ratcheted up at the state level, that you might start seeing some of these public-private partnerships come to fruition. So here's a quote that we have on public-private partnerships. It's a good quote from a nonprofit participant. And one of the things that we consistently heard was some of the examples from Maryland. So we've been really good about getting the word out about what's happening in Maryland. But this individual says, "I've heard about P3s and presentations about Maryland and other places, and it's all a lovely idea. What's missing here is the regulatory urgency and requirement to take action. And lacking that, I've never heard a presentation like, oh, I can see how that would work here. There's nothing forcing the communities to do this work. And without that, I just don't know how the P3s work." But again, at the local level, we did hear some people give us some examples of, you know, perhaps the public sector working with the private sector to create some sort of public benefit, maybe on a private property or something like that, but nothing really to the scale that's happening in a place like Maryland.
So next we're going to talk about special tax assessments, and only a quarter of our participants were actually familiar with special tax assessments as a funding model. So what these are a form of government financing that assesses residents in proportion to the special benefits they receive from various public goods and services. So in short, it's a benefiter pays financing model. This mechanism also requires enabling legislation. However, unlike tax increment financing and stormwater utilities, this legislation has not been passed statewide. Some specific municipalities, such as Middletown, have passed the necessary legislation. Another local example can be found in Warwick, where they have recently applied a special tax assessment to property owners for sewage installations.
So again, this is probably one of the financing instruments that's most ripe for education, especially for folks at the municipal level or even folks at the state level and some of our nonprofits. For those who actually had knowledge of special tax assessments, they described the benefit of being a benefiter pays model. The key challenge with this approach was some of the property owner opposition, perhaps equity. One of the concerns was that you know, you're placing this assessment on folks that might not be able to afford it. And then there's also always a difficult challenge of drawing boundaries. And when you're drawing tax boundaries, you have, you know, the challenge of, you know, people that don't want to be in that tax boundary. But then also, I think one of the things that was the most surprising to me was talking to a DPW director who had actually been involved in some of the special tax assessments in the DPW director's jurisdiction. And the DPW director explained to me that there were some people that were lobbying to get into the special tax assessment district or the special district because they would have been able to benefit from whatever upgrade that was being put in or anything like that. So the opposition could actually go both ways, and so that could prove to be very tricky. Here's a really interesting quote from somebody who was involved at the state level on special tax assessments. This person had said, the municipality has a sewer authority that has that special enabling legislation to assess those fees. And again, there's a public health and safety issue there, because without that, you're in Warwick discharging raw sewage, untreated sewage. It was impacting, health as well as water quality. So there was a clean nexus there. And even then, it can be challenging because it was a low income area. DEM and the sewer authority at the time was reticent to force people to tie in. So they were still discharging untreated sewage into the cove in Warwick. It was outrageous. So we tried to get some grant money to help low-income folks tie in. And then even when we did that, there was a state rep who said, well, this neighborhood is so low income, they don't want to tie in because now they're going to be assessed an annual sewer fee, where now they don't pay anything. They're just illegally discharged into the cove. So again, that kind of captures the opposition, and it captures some of the equity issues that might be involved with special tax assessments. We also wanted to create, develop a funding option, and I'll be explaining this one. We wanted to develop a funding option that really isn't out there yet, or one that might, where if you were able to get some creative people together to design something that could move the discussion forward about green infrastructure, resilience, and stormwater management. So one of the things that we did was we asked our participants about what it would entail to create a residential scale green infrastructure property tax exemption. And this would be very familiar to maybe the property tax exemptions you get for being a veteran. So I'm a veteran and I get a $250 tax exemption every year for being a veteran. Sometimes you have the senior citizens tax exemptions. In Narragansett, you have a tax exemption for people that make improvements to their homes in historic districts. So there's also some potential there of taking models like that and applying it to people that are doing the right thing on their property for green infrastructure. So again, this would be something that would reward property owners for doing the right thing on their properties, which could facilitate the transition to a more robust funding model and allow municipalities to act now. So the idea behind this type of approach wouldn't be, hey, look, we're gonna put into place this tax exemption and it's really gonna move the needle and solve all of our stormwater and resilience problems. The idea of this tax exemption would be, let's use a tax exemption as a tool for educating the public about doing the right thing on their property, reward them for doing the right thing on their property, and then perhaps use private industry as a vehicle for informing local property owners that this is something that they can do on their property when they're getting landscaping services and things like that. And there's a lot of creative ways that I've thought about how something like a tax exemption could work in practice. There's a lot of challenges though too, and I'll talk about them now. But one of the key challenges that we'll hear about in a little bit is the difficulty of actually, and Courtney, can you go to the next slide and we'll go back to this slide in 1 second. I'll just go through some of the challenges and the benefits, and then I'll go back to that previous slide. But participants overwhelmingly cited the financial incentives as being the key benefit of an approach like that. So very few people had ever heard of anything like this even happening. In fact, nobody had ever heard of anything like this happening. Some of the challenges though were that participants identified revenue loss as something that might happen. And then there's also the administrative burden of executing one of these tax exemptions. One of the things that we were kind of thinking about though, to kind of get around some of the administrative burden and the revenue loss, would be to perhaps maybe start in, maybe there's a town that would like to do a pilot project in a certain part of town where they might actually be able to apply a special tax exemption in maybe a part of town that is very troublesome. So Courtney, if you go back to that previous slide, you'll see one of the things I've done is I live in Bristol. That's the only reason why I use this as an example. And this is kind of the area where I lived. But maybe one of the things that you could do is you could create some sort of special district or a special opt-in area where maybe residents would be able to, get some sort of tax exemption for making an improvement to their property that could improve the water quality in their watershed or prevent fertilizers from entering water bodies and things like that. But you can see here, I just quickly drew a boundary, and that boundary actually extends that I drew there, extends into Warren. There could be some possibilities of having something like this be regional in nature, where you really look for the most troublesome areas and use that tax exemption as an education tool and as a tool for people to do the right thing on their property. Again, I don't think that that's something that would be able to be done without the help of the landscape industry to be the vehicle for explaining a lot of that stuff. But here's a quote from a municipal employee about the potential of having something like that kind of captures some of this municipal employees' concerns. This individual said, I think there was a state bill this session that would give tax exemptions to anyone who does improvements on their property for climate resilience. And I saw that circulate among our tax assessors, like, what kind of impact would this have on our taxable revenue or taxable income? More so our concern for the city's financial health, and less so it's we want people to invest in climate resilience. So I can't see that being a popular one. All right, we also had some questions for our participants about structure. And again, I kind of described localism in Rhode Island as one of those things where there's a lot of power that's centered at the local level in Rhode Island. There's a lot of decision making at the local level. There's a lot of maintenance that's done at the local level. There's a lot of construction that's done at the local level. So Courtney, we can go to the next slide. So we asked participants to share their views about the costs and benefits of local decision making in Rhode Island, and the most cited benefit of local decision making was local knowledge. So people were overwhelmingly cited that as a benefit, that with local knowledge, there's some communities that know a lot more about political feasibility of doing anything versus maybe the state has less knowledge about that, or maybe private consultants have less knowledge about that, or responsiveness, right? So, hey, there's a part of the town that's been flooding a lot. Or now it's flooding, so then you can get on the phone, call the DPW director, and get to that part of town to clean out catch basins or something like that. So that was something that people were talking about. The other one, the most cited challenge of local decision making, again, was capacity of municipalities to complete some of these projects. And again, that was most cited by folks that weren't in the municipalities, which is very interesting to us, at least. Here's a quick table that describes some of the benefits that were described. You'll see some of the benefits were local knowledge and control, responsiveness, able to exceed the minimum state standards, so to go above and beyond what the state is saying, local support, being able to partner with the state, and then policy innovation. So having 39 different municipalities experimenting with different ways of tackling these issues, and then seeing something that emerges as kind of a model that others can replicate. Some of the localism challenges, of course, that were described were incapacity, the cross-border pollution issue, because we know that damaged water does not stop at man-made boundaries or municipal boundaries. Maintenance was always an issue that came up, making sure that municipalities, once they've put into place a BMP or something like that, is it being appropriately maintained? Is there the funding for the maintenance? And so on and so forth. So you can read all those. Again, this slide will be available to everybody, or the whole PowerPoint, I believe, has been made available to everybody. So you can look through these on your own time. We also asked our participants, what does change look like? If you were able to wave a magic wand and you were able to make any kind of change, whether it be jurisdictional change, financing, anything like that, what would change look like in your mind? And one of the things that folks talked about was jurisdictional change. And we had 40 this came up 40 times in our interviews. 13 of our respondents preferred to have municipalities responsible for stormwater, green infrastructure, climate resilience type projects. 13 were supportive of that approach. Whereas 13 folks were supportive of the regional approach, and then 11 were supportive of having some sort of statewide control over this particular issue. Now, what was interesting to me was that when I broke down the interviews, I went to look back to see how many municipalities or how many municipal officials described having a desire for having municipal control over this. Most municipal officials that I interviewed thought a regional approach would be best. And so I thought that that was a very interesting insight that we've generated from this, whereas it was maybe some of the others, like from private industry or nonprofits, who were thinking that a municipal might be the best way to do things. So I thought that that was very interesting. It's also interesting to see, again, maintenance come up. It was a prevailing theme throughout all of our interviews that there was a concern that not enough maintenance was being done. So there were some people that would have preferred to, if they could wave their magic wand, they would have wanted to make some sort of change to maintenance by having maybe some continuous maintenance regime, or having a DPW director of stormwater that was responsible for just maintenance. Enforcement was something that came up too. So we had 3 respondents, or it came up 3 times in our interviews, that people wanted to see stricter state enforcement. Engagement was an issue that kind of came up a lot. And one of the reasons why, I'm not saying that any one of these issues is any more important than the others, but I think one of the things that we ought to do is we ought to take all of these different concepts into consideration. And when we're designing policy, we might want to hit on each one of these concepts that some of our respondents were talking about. So we might want to talk about jurisdiction. We might want to talk about how do we make sure that maintenance is covered. We might want to talk a little bit about enforcement. We might want to plan on how do we have appropriate stakeholder engagement for delivering this public policy. So that brings us to some of our recommendations. And one of the things I'll preface this by saying is that we still have a lot of analysis to do. We just really scratched the surface with our preliminary analysis of some of these patterns that we were analyzing. We're also going to start breaking things down a little bit and kind of seeing what folks are talking about at the local level versus the state level versus the private sector. And we're going to probably transform the data a little bit to see what people are talking about in terms of their municipalities and everything. But here are some recommendations that we've come up with, and I'll try to go over these quickly just so that we have some time for questions and everything like that. But one of the things that we noticed was that participants described public education as a persistent challenge for almost all financing mechanisms. And so we want to encourage folks to tailor the level of stakeholder engagement efforts to the public's knowledge gap on some of these issues. And there's already some phenomenal people that are doing stakeholder engagement and working on these issues. I know we have folks over at DEM that are, this is their specialty is stakeholder engagement. And so those efforts need to continue to be supported. And a lot of the research shows that stakeholder engagement is critical. It's not critical just for engaging the community, but it's critical for also engaging folks that are in municipalities, that are municipal employees and everything like that, because they have access to decision makers. And then another recommendation we have is that for those financing mechanisms that pose political challenges, one of the things that we would recommend to do would be to consider adopting incremental financing instruments, not tax increment financing, but incremental financing instruments that reward property owners for doing the right thing. Okay, so like one of the things I have kind of been thinking about is that we have all these great projects, all these great grants and all the bonds. They really go toward these huge like point source stormwater projects, right? But then we have all these non-point source problems, right, on residential properties, right? And so what happens when we start thinking about non-point source pollution or non-point source solutions to non-point source problems? And so we certainly want to continue to think about ways that we can engage property owners, because when we engage property owners about doing the right thing on their property, then we're teaching or we're educating property owners who have some very strong roots in those communities about stormwater, about the importance of climate resiliency, about green infrastructure. All right, then a couple of remaining recommendations that we have. One of the things that we saw was that the regional approach. Folks were talking about a regional approach being an approach that they would have liked to see. So begin developing regional capacity by identifying opportunities to work with other municipalities on watershed level problems. And I know that some of this is happening in Rhode Island, and we hope that it continues to happen. Because if there's regional partnerships that are being made, maybe other towns will see those regional partnerships becoming successful. Maybe they'll see the cost savings of those regional partnerships happening, and maybe they'll want to be a part of that regional partnership as well. So even if there's little things that can be done, like little, even voluntary efforts by 2 municipalities to come together to do residential stormwater training or to do workshops on those types of things together, now all of a sudden we have people from 2 different communities coming together and talking and networking and sharing a common purpose, because we all share a common watershed oftentimes across these municipal boundaries. And then lastly, I do want to point out that the financing instruments that we studied are made for projects that are designed, permitted, and ready to receive financing. And so we need to continue to support efforts that are being made to build an inventory of projects that can be developed as concepts. And there's programs like this happening in Rhode Island. We saw a lot of our participants that were really excited about the municipal resiliency program. And so those types of programs are great models for how we can continue these types of efforts. And perhaps maybe one of the things that, if it hasn't been done yet, maybe there needs to be worked in a program evaluation of something like the municipal resiliency program, so that there's a comprehensive case study that's put together so that other communities, other states can see what's happening, and they can adopt some of the same successes that we have here in Rhode Island with those particular programs. Because again, when one community is successful, we're all successful, because we all share the same watersheds. Water and pollution and all that does not know man-made boundaries. So if we can move the needle on this by showing what we're doing here in Rhode Island, I think that would be awesome. So that's all I have for, and I think we have a slide here for questions. So what we can do is, if you have any questions, I think Tess might be filtering some of these questions, or she might be facilitating some of the engagement that we have with our audience here.
Yeah, we have several questions that came in for you guys, starting almost right away at the beginning. So covering this first kind of set goes back to your comments about grants. And we had a really thoughtful comment first about the nature of lack of capacity and potentially how that might implement, or why that might even impact your study even. And we had a request to elaborate on the challenges and benefits for grants.
Okay. So one of the things I'm going to do is, I'm not going to share my screen because I don't want to share my participants, but one of the things that I could do a little bit is, Courtney, is it possible that we can go back to the slide on grants, the challenges of grants and things like that, or the challenges and benefits of grants? There we go. Yeah, that's really interesting, Tess, and thank you for the comment about the capacity. And now that I'm hearing that a little bit, it's making me think of how that might impact the study. And my quick twitch on that one is that it could affect our study in terms of the challenges. So if capacity is a challenge and it's not coming from municipalities, then it could be that we aren't talking to municipalities that are having capacity issues because they already have capacity issues. They don't have the time to talk to somebody that's doing research about this. So there might be a self-selection issue, and that's a comment that I really do appreciate a lot. In terms of challenges and benefits, again, these are a lot of quick twitch responses from people. These are coming from a lot of different sectors. Networking and education, folks were talking about, hey, look, we can take this model project that we've done and we can share it with others. We can get feedback on this particular project. We can hear about some of the challenges that other communities might have had if they did a similar project. Others liked it, grants for maybe specific projects. Some said things like, hey, we can take a grant, we can do this big project, and you know what? Once we're done with the grant, we've moved on from the project, okay? So some people liked that there was a beginning and an end. Leverage was another issue, being able to leverage grants with bonds or things like that, so they felt that there was a little bit of flexibility with it. An interesting comment that came up was about federal prevailing wage. We had somebody from a landscaping industry that was really involved with working with municipalities on grants, or they actually got grants as well. And one of the things that they were able to get was a higher rate of pay for some of their landscapers when these particular projects came through grants, whereas maybe some of the other funding models, they paid a little bit less. One individual really liked the idea that instead of having to go out and do fundraising and ask for money and to ask for high dollar amounts from people at parties and things like that, that it was nice to be able to sit down and do a grant. Other firms were talking about how they were able to compete against some of the bigger. It might have been harder for them to compete on an RFP that like an RFP that went out for bid or something like that, because they just didn't have the economy of scale that maybe some of the larger organizations had. So they felt like they were able to compete a little bit more for grants. And then they were also able to maybe perhaps write in workforce development to their grant, because another thing that came up was that there really isn't a workforce for maintenance and for green infrastructure and stormwater maintenance. And one of the things that they kind of talked about was how do we develop that workforce so that we can provide the supply that's being demanded by some of these landscaping companies. I'll just quickly go through some of the challenges so that we have time if there's any other questions that pop out or anything like that. Some of the challenges were politics, believe it or not. Some of these communities, they would bring maybe a grant to a town council or something like that, and town councils wouldn't support the grant because it might require a match. So there were some political issues that were associated with that. There was some uncertainty with grants. Hey, we're working on this grant, but we don't know if we're going to be getting the grant. You have a lot of different grant programs out there, so you had a lot of different grant requirements. There were, opportunity costs. So that grant management, it was a challenge, but some people were really good at grant management. They were able to do things like if they got a grant for, improving a playground or something like that, they were able to, make some improvements to a parking lot, and they were just very effective at solving little puzzles when they were doing grants, but it was still nevertheless a challenge for them. So.
Great. Yeah, thank you for elaborating. It really strikes me as important how these hidden costs of grants kind of are hard to know and understand from just when you think, oh, free money. Okay, then next we got two questions kind of related to, do you think that inflation will impact some of these options? And then which of the financing options will rising inflation rates have the biggest impact on, if you might speculate on that?
That's a really good question. And I've thought about that a little bit myself, because, the bond, if those bond rates are increasing, then you might be seeing that bonds are kind of a less, an approach that is less attractive. And so that might take certain things off the table. So like if you have certain types of bonds that are even more, expensive than general obligation bonds, all of a sudden that might take some of those off the table as well. Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think then all of a sudden, I think one of the things that we're actually seeing with municipalities is that when it becomes a little bit more expensive to bond, then they start doing things like they start shifting some of their spending through their operating or through their general fund. And so they'll start using taxpayer money to fund certain types of projects rather than bonds and things like that. You know, certainly it's something that has been the conversation in the town where I'm from, is that we have a 5-year capital project. There's a lot of bonds that are in that 5-year capital project, but that 5-year capital project, 5-year capital plan is a vision, and that vision can always be adjusted a little bit so that, you know, maybe operating capital is being used for some of these projects versus some of the other ones. So yeah, and I think like if you have a stormwater utility, obviously one of the things is that's how you're getting your maintenance, right? You're getting your maintenance, it's 0 interest, you're getting this money right from you know, property owners or residents from the town. And so as you're seeing an increase in bonding rates, or if you're seeing the Fed really clamp down on certain types of things, now you might start seeing some of those opportunities where it might be something that's considered to be a cost savings if a stormwater utility is actually adopted. Now, the other thing that really kind of came up with the stormwater utility, and one of the challenges that somebody talked about that I thought was really kind of made me raise my eyebrows, something I really didn't think about all that much, was that in some communities, they essentially already have all their stormwater maintenance and management and everything like that packaged together in their general budget. So that's already kind of taken care of. And so a stormwater utility essentially just takes whatever is in that general budget and earmarks it for that specific thing. And that can be, you know, a positive thing when you're taking it out of the general budget, because then it'll stay that way, right? Whereas, you know, if it's in the general budget or is, you know, financed through operating costs and things like that, then all of a sudden, if you have a change in leadership in the town, you can always lose the money that's being budgeted for stormwater management and maintenance and everything like that.
Yeah, and I'm sure it'll become more complex as we see, you know, how this evolves over the next few years. Okay, so the next question that we still have a few minutes. So I think, and this will be good for both of you, it'll be interesting to get both of your takes on this, but prior to conducting the interviews or starting the study, what were your perspectives on these different mechanisms and how did they change through this process?
That's a really good question. Courtney, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I'm gonna be honest, when we first started this, I wasn't very familiar with a lot of them. I was familiar with grants, a little bit familiar with bonding, but the tax equipment financing and the stormwater utilities, I wasn't aware of at all, excuse me. But after doing the study and seeing how everybody knew about the stormwater utilities and they were even conducting studies, there was all this legislation, but then nobody had done it yet. It kind of shifted my perspective on the politics of it all. It showed me that there is some benefit to that type of approach. And it's kind of interesting to see how you have the education piece really, and the rain tags labeling is what's kind of getting in the way of that and the political hurdle. So I thought that was very interesting. And it really did open my eyes as well to how unsustainable grants and bonding is, because that's not guaranteed money. So you get your grant, and then once that money is gone, you can't get it back. You have to go apply for another one. So it's just this cycle of applying for different grants over and over again, or doing different bonds over and over again. And it's not sustainable. So I thought that was all interesting, how the two most dominant mechanisms are like one of the least sustainable ones that we were interested in studying.
Yeah, what I'll say, I'll quickly, try to, this is probably the most surprising thing to me, was the level of knowledge that planners had. And I think one of the things is all the planners overwhelmingly seemed to want to solve this issue, the people that were in the planning community and everything like that. And they were the ones that had the most knowledge of all the different financing mechanisms that were out there. And I think one of the things that we're going to want to do is, you know, if this is an issue that needs to be solved, if it's an issue where you're trying to get around some of the politics of it, that it might benefit us to consider thinking about grooming some of the leadership of some of our planners so that they can start having the skills or start getting into a position where they can become town managers, city managers, perhaps elected officials, because they, to me, they seem to have some of the most knowledge of these issues. And I'll also add that the consultants were very knowledgeable about the financing instruments. They were, some of them knew every single one. And they knew every single one because they were working in other communities and things like that. So it was really valuable to see kind of who at the local level was really the most knowledgeable about these types of things. And I think we really have to give those planners a whole lot of credit for the hard work that they're doing. And sometimes if they are having those capacity issues, if other, you know, if it is a fact that there is capacity issues that's happening at the local level, then you really got to give them credit for what they've been able to do.
Yeah, they definitely deserve some celebration. Well, it is the top of the hour, it's noon, and we didn't quite get to every single question here, but I will make sure that all of your questions make it into Aaron and Courtney's hands. And I do want to mention we got one question about curiosity about PDHs and CEUs, and what I can tell you is that we can't guarantee that your agency or board will accept this webinar, but we can provide a courtesy certificate, and Leah Soloway's contact information is in your follow-up email to request one. All right, are there any closing comments from you, Aaron and Courtney?
No, just thanks for doing this. Thanks for all the work that you're doing. We're really excited about continuing the work that we're doing. And if there are folks who feel like there could be some good collaborations with the work that we've done, we're interested in maybe if we could use an MPA program in service to the state. That's what we're here for. We're here for technical assistance, or for generating ideas, or for allowing everybody to have a forum where we can have discussions about these very important issues.
I totally agree. And please, everyone, please continue to reach out to our speakers and to Leah to let us know what else you can contribute to the conversation. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.